Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Our guests on this episode of Writers at Work are Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child, whose latest novels, Angel of Vengeance and The Cabinet of Dr. Leng, are an absolute delight. Collectively and individually, they are frequent residents of the New York Times bestseller list, and their first novel together, Relic, published in 1995, is considered among the great contemporary thrillers. By my count, they've written more than 20 novels together and maintain busy publishing schedules as solo authors. Doug is also a journalist of the highest order, publishing nonfiction books and long-form articles in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and others. I recommend without reservation his The Monster of Florence, written with Italian journalist Mario Spizzi, about a series of sex-related murders committed across 3 decades. There's much to talk about with both writers. On this episode, I'd like to focus on the mechanisms of their partnership. Douglas Preston and Lincoln Child, welcome to Writers at Work.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. It's good to be here.
Okay. Listen, we're not very formal here, so either of you can jump in whenever you'd like. As I understand, Link, you edited Doug's first nonfiction book, Dinosaurs in the Attic, about the American Museum of Natural History, back in '86. What did you see in Doug's writing that appealed to you?
In brief, what happened was I was an editor at St. Martin's, and as all editors are, I was looking rapaciously for possible books to publish. And I was a big fan of the museum. And I had taken on their behind-the-scenes tours, and I thought the museum would be a great place to set a book. You know, all the people who've worked there and the larger-than-life legends who've looted tombs and everything else. But I had to find somebody who knew enough about it. So I did some digging, and I found that this person named Douglas Preston was the one who wrote most of the articles in their magazine relating to the museum's history. And I took him to lunch at the Russian Tea Room, and I pitched the idea. And he was ready to go from articles to long form. And the result of that was Dinosaurs in the Attic, as you mentioned. And that's how the whole mess started.
And Doug, what did you like about the way Link proposed and handled your work?
Well, I was very impressed about getting invited to lunch at the Russian Tea Room. I had to rush down to the Salvation Army and buy a jacket so I could get in. So I thought, well, this is going to be good. And so I wrote the book, submitted the manuscript. Link loved it, and it was published. And then Link asked me for a favor. And the favor was that he wanted a real behind-the-scenes tour of the museum. He wanted to see the weird stuff, the storage rooms that nobody else ever sees. And I said, I tried to explain to Link that I was just a young employee. I didn't have, I didn't have the authority to take him around, but he kept bugging me. So finally I said, all right, I'll take you around, but it's going to be after the museum closes. It's going to be late at night when I won't be challenged. And I did have a key. This is in the days when the museum had terrible security. I had a key that opened many doors. It was a skeleton key to the museum. It opened maybe 1 out of 5 doors. So I gave him a tour at midnight, and we ended up in one of the dinosaur halls at like 2 in the morning, and it was all the lights are off except for the emergency fluorescent lighting, the strip lighting in the ceiling, which was far more dramatic than the regular lighting. These big Tyrannosaurus Rexes looming above us. And Lincoln turned to me and said, Doug, my God, this is the scariest building in the world. We've got to write a thriller set in this building. And I said, Link, I don't know anything about writing thrillers. And he said, well, I do, because I've read so many bad manuscripts. As an editor at St. Martin's Press, I know exactly what not to do.
So that's how Relic came about.
That is.
Link, did you have a master plan in mind, or did you just decide you liked working together and start riffing?
My only master plan was that ever since I was about 4 years old, I wanted to write fiction. I remember my dad, who was a college professor, bringing home empty blue books, and I would just fill them with lines and scribbles since I didn't know how to write. I wrote a novel in high school that was just terrible. Um, but at college, and it's at St. Martin's, I sort of got a surfeit of cynicism and analytical overload, and the writing urge dried up in me. Um, but I still love to read, and I still thought I had a book in me. And when Doug proposed a mystery novel that he would write, set in the museum, it occurred to me that we could write a book together. And since he seemed to be really good at churning out material, good material, I mean to say, at a quick rate, we could try and do it together. And of course, it was we both had other jobs, and it was a flyer, and also, but the good thing was, I think this is a good thing. We were very self-indulgent. We really wrote the book we wanted to write, and we didn't take it too seriously or ourselves too seriously. And I think had we done that, Pendergast would never have come out as eccentric as he did. So it took 5 years to finish, and another couple of years to get accepted, probably. But no, I didn't know at the time that's what would happen. But I'm sure as hell glad that things fit into place the way they did.
Doug, did you take well to writing fiction? Moving from nonfiction to fiction, did you find you had the skill set for it? And then what was the process that you and Link developed to make the book work?
Well, first of all, I was a little embarrassed. I had very high opinion of myself as a writer. And I was, if I wasn't going to win a Nobel Prize, I was at least going to get a Pulitzer or two. And I took myself very seriously. And I found in the beginning, I was rather embarrassed to be writing a novel about a brain-eating monster in a museum. and But the truth is, I really had fun writing it. It was so much more fun than writing my serious nonfiction. And I really enjoyed working with Lincoln. He's a fine fellow, really a good fellow to work with, except when he rewrites my deathless prose, which I resented enormously. But other than that, we really had a good time writing the novel. It was only going to be a one-off, but it was a bestseller. It was picked up and made into a #1 box office hit movie by Paramount Pictures, and I suddenly went from being an impoverished, struggling writer to being someone with some money in my pocket. And I love doing it. So we continued. And
Great.
and here we are, 30 books later or something.
Is it 30? Wow.
No, it's more like 40.
Oh my God.
Well, wait, not counting our solo books, I think it's close. I think Doug's right. Yeah, it's about
Wow.
32, 33.
Yeah. One of the outstanding characteristics of the book that you do together is the level of scientific detail. And one of the things I find amazing about these books is that you achieve what I consider to be seemingly impossible. They're scientific tutorials, and yet at the same time, they're breezy reads. I mean, how do you balance that?
That's something that I learned the hard way as an editor at St. Martin's. And I think that Doug or almost any reader could probably say the same thing. When you're an editor, my boss always drilled into me that the average reader will put a book down and say, that was okay, but wasn't all that great. But the editor's job is to say, it wasn't that great, and these are the reasons why, and this is how you fix it. And so I learned from reading many, many awful manuscripts and a few great ones, just, that how much to keep in, how much to use to tease the reader with, how much scientific information to use to make them suspend their disbelief, but not so much as to make their eyes glaze over. And we wrote about what we knew to a degree and what we liked too, which my grandmother, who was a writer, always told me to do. And of course, it wasn't a process that came out fully formed in the relic. It took us several books to master the craft, if we can even say to have mastered it. But I knew the tricks and the pitfalls, and Doug, I think, instinctively knew them too from being such a voracious reader.
I see. Does that correspond to your memory, Doug?
It does. There's always this very difficult balancing act. You really have to be careful with the pacing of a thriller. The pacing is so important. And so if you're going to have scientific information, it's got to be worked in very nicely into the matrix so that you're not having a big bolus of information dropped, into a manuscript. But you also can't have, long character descriptions, or you can't have 2 pages of scene setting either. Each chapter has to move the story forward. So these are all things that Lincoln and I, because of, had to work out as writers. We even after 30 or 40 novels, we're still trying to work it out. And,
I'm sorry to interrupt, Doug. What is the process now when you begin a Preston and Child novel?
well, we plot it together. We bounce around ideas. We go on the phone every day, writing stuff down, rejecting ideas, discussing, arguing. And finally, we come up with a nugget, an idea. Now, there's a huge journey from an idea to a plot. And that's where most people don't, that's where most writers fail, because they think that with a great idea, that's all they need. And turning that into a plot with characters in it. So anyway, we finally come up with a basic plot, and then we outline the first maybe 15 or 20 chapters. Link takes a thread of chapters from one character's point of view. I'll take a thread from another character's point of view. We each write our chapters, and we swap. And that's when Link rewrites my gorgeous prose and ruins it. At least that's how it feels sometimes. And I know that I feel the same way when Link rewrites me. But the fact is, what we're doing is, as the saying goes, we are massacring each other's little darlings.
But the writing is seamless. That I just read the 2 new Pendergast novels consecutively, and the writing is seamless. I don't know who does what, and I was trying to figure that out. Lincoln, do you revert to your old red pencil roll at any point, or once you guys get your pages down, is it pretty much what you wanted?
Well, the process, that's a very good question. The process has changed somewhat over the years. Doug wrote the lion's share, and I did most of the plotting and editing early on. But now we work hard to make sure we take equal, oftentimes I will champion a certain book in terms of being the one who drives it along, and Doug will champion another book. But in the main, our goal is to do exactly what you just mentioned, which is to make it seamless. And it's not something that we do consciously, because we've each written novels on our own, in which we work with our own voices. And it's possible that if we sat you down and told you who wrote the basis for one chapter and who wrote the basis for the other, you might begin to see a little glimmer But but the fact is, when we work together, I think we sort of unconsciously get into a mindset of writing a Preston child book. Um, and certainly, as we revise and edit and re-revise those chapters, that becomes the case. I take a Zamboni over the whole thing at the end and polish it. And I also want to add that when we first started out, the idea of two people writing a novel together was like anathema. That was one of the problems we had. And in fact, in England, we were known as Lincoln Preston for the first half a dozen or dozen books.
Oh, is that
Nobody
so?
could figure out how two guys could write a book together. But of course, the fact is that there are ghostwriters and paid writers all over the place out there. But we don't do that. We write every word of these books because that's what we love to do. And if we couldn't write them anymore for whatever reason, we would just stop, because writing these books is what we both like most of all, at least in terms of work.
Oh. Doug, you used the word fun earlier. Another thing I find so appealing about your books is there's a sense of delight in the narrative. Maybe I'm reading your books as a writer when I say this, but I come upon a certain section and I think, oh, they must have had so much fun putting this in this place. And do you delight each other when you do things like that?
We do actually. We're in sort of competition. I remember when we were writing The Cabinet of Curiosities, which, by the way, is now being made into a television series. The final scenes of the book involve a person who is poisoned and horribly poisoned. And so I wrote this description, this horrifying, disgusting description of this person dying of this poisoning. And then Lincoln got his hands on it and made it even worse. And then I got my hands on it and made it even worse. And at a certain point, it was absurd. And we thought, well, let's just submit it and see what our editor says. So we submitted it, and the editor said, "Oh, this is really horrifying. Oh my God, we're not going to change this at all." But
I'm sorry, I was going to ask you, does one or the other have to stop you from going too far? But apparently you want to go too far.
we're always
Jim,
going too far.
Jim, that's a good question. There's certain things that are off limits to us. We don't like involving children in danger, and we don't like certain kinds of gratuity. We're terrible at writing sex scenes, so we've given up on that. We haven't had the time to do the research on that. But we really, we do have a lot of fun, and that's what Doug is right. And they're in jokes to each other. They're in jokes to our long-term audience. There are things that nobody will get, but it doesn't matter. I'll give you one example. I was reading an old book called Penrod by Booth Tarkington, who's a forgotten writer, very popular at the turn of the 20th century. And he was describing a fight among two boys in which every time one of the boys got up, the other one would assist him into a recumbent position. And I laughed at that line because it was so, ironic and over to the top and dry the mummy's bandages. And I said to Doug, I showed it to him and we both laughed. And then we put a variant of that in one of our books. Just to keep the old language alive.
Yeah,
And
sure.
that's fun for us. And people are always looking up words in our books, and looking up things they don't know about, or emailing us to say, thank you for explaining. I never knew about how XYZ works. And not to say that we're experts, but we do enough research to get that foundation in place so we can build our fiction on top of it.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Doug. I'm sorry.
I was, he used an example from another author, but I'm going to give you an example out of Relic. It's a little bit off color. Is this okay?
Yeah, sure, please.
Well,
Oh
I wrote
God.
I wrote that there was a famous anthropologist at the museum who had done seminal work among the natives of Borneo. And Lincoln, it went right over Lincoln's head. I mean, there's a double entendre in there, but I'm not going to explain it.
That's funny. Listen, I don't want to give too much away because as I said, I just finished reading these two books and I love them. But I noticed that you take some decisions with your familiar characters that suggest new possibilities for future novels or future series. Do these possibilities emerge organically, or, for example, when you made a change in Diogenes? Did you think to yourself, "Oh, this could make a new direction for the series, or we could start a new series with this"?
It's really both. For example, you mentioned Diogenes. I think you mentioned Diogenes.
Yeah, I did.
In a dream sequence, for want of a better word, in Cabinet that Pendergast has, he sees himself going through his family mansion years ago, and I just happened to write in the sentence that he passes his brother's door, bolted over with metal and riveted closed, never to be opened. And I've put that in there as a teaser without meaning for anything else to happen. But books later we went and ran with it. And also, Doug had a brilliant idea, I think, of adding Diogenes to the mix in this newest series of books where our heroes are really up against their most formidable foe and somebody who could very easily overmaster them. So there are things that we put in and don't put in. I mean, I remember asking Doug recently, what should we do next? And he said, well, we haven't killed a dog in a while. Which is a reference to whenever an animal dies in our books, we get swamped with letters about, oh, how could you? No matter, even if it's a murderous German Shepherd owned by a bunch of neo-Nazis, it doesn't matter. But 100 people can die, and that's doesn't seem to arouse any consternation on readers' part. So I keep asking Doug to let me put on the copyright page, no animals were harmed during the writing of this book.
That's
So
pretty
far,
funny.
he hasn't let me.
In the cabinet of Dr. Lang features a note to readers in which you apologize for leaving us hanging. Now that the follow-up is out, that's superfluous, but you say that when you began the book that precedes Dr. Lang, you realized the overarching story was something other than you initially envisioned. When something like that happens, do you panic, or have you been doing it for so long that you like that kind of need to adapt?
We like that. Well, in that particular case, we had an idea for a self-contained novel, which became Bloodless. But at the end of the novel, we realized that there was this unbelievable opportunity to continue the story in a totally cool way, really, really awesome way. But that was going to take 2 more books. And so we launched into it knowing that the second book was going to leave readers hanging. And it did. I mean, readers were furious. I remember my wife was saying to me, she got to the page, 10 pages from the end, and she said, it suddenly dawned on me. I kept thinking, how are they going to resolve this in the pages left? How are they going to resolve this? And about 10 pages from the end, I realized they aren't going to resolve this. And I was furious. I was absolutely furious at you. How can you do this? Well, we just have big stories we want to tell. And I don't know, we can't stuff them all in like War and Peace into one book, because who would buy a 1,200 page book? So you got to stretch them out.
But also in this case, we felt that it was a chance for us to wrap up a lot of impedimenta and loose ends and family history that's been dragging on for many books that we find fascinating, and some of our readers do, but that might be holding us back from writing, standalone books of Pendergast on his own, or with the Augusta or Constance solving a mystery. And we knew this would be difficult. People would be angry after the first two books, just like they were probably angry after the first two Tolkien books. Not that I'm comparing us to him, but
I get you.
now that they're all out, I think that it's best this way, and we're unencumbered, and we can go forward now with a lot of that baggage, hopefully very interestingly and definitively solved.
Yeah.
But who knows?
So what's next for Douglas, Preston, and Lincoln Child? Do you have a project underway? Are you still talking? Where are you guys?
Well, we've got a new book that's coming out, not in the Pendergast series, but we spun off a series featuring Nora Kelly, who's an archaeologist who worked with Pendergast on some of his early cases, and Corey Swanson, who was a teenager in one of the early Pendergast books, but is now a young FBI agent. And so the two of them, Nora Kelly and Corey Swanson, are involved in a series of interesting cases in New Mexico. And so this one is called Badlands, and it involves a very strange series of suicides, apparently, in the Badlands of New Mexico. And we just submitted the manuscript, and we heard from our editor that she loves it, but we haven't gotten our editorial letter yet. And I don't know when it's going to be published. Link, do you have a pub date on that?
I think it's next April, but don't hold me to that. But Jim, we also have we are also beginning work on the next Pendergast, and we're planning this one to be effectively his origin story, his first case for the FBI, which shows him as himself, but you can imagine what goes on and what he has to learn and what people around him have to learn. And the end of it will segue into the beginning of Relic. So we're bringing the story full circle.
Fascinating. Our guests on this episode of Writers at Work have been Doug Preston and Link Child. Thanks very much for your time and insights, men. I loved it.
Well, Jim, thank you. You asked some really good questions.
My pleasure. Link, see you soon.
We had a great time too. Thank you.
Okay, man. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.